Hello everybody. We are going to pick up with where we left off in the last class. So we ended Web 1 talking about events and event handling, and that's what we're going to do right now to kick off this class. So go ahead and get the sample code ready so you can copy and paste the sample code into a new file. The sample code can be found on the web page that goes along with this video. Just create a new file. I gave it this name right here, and then paste the code in there, and we're off and running here. Okay, so here on line 8, I think it is, hopefully it's the same line for you, but around there's a comment. Let's go ahead and delete that comment. And what we should do is we should wait until the window loads before we run any JavaScript. So this is something that we saw last semester. So let's start off our script looking like this. We'll take the window object and we'll call the add event listener method. And then the first parameter is going to be a string that says load. So in other words, we're going to wait for the load event to occur on the window object. And then for the second parameter, I'm going to put a comma there. And now here's where we put our function, our event handler function. Okay, last semester we used the classic functions, the old school syntax. This semester we're going to use mostly arrow functions. So to do that, we put in a pair of parentheses followed by what they call the fat arrow, and then a pair of curly braces. So there we go. We're using an arrow function for our event handler, and then split those curly braces apart like that, and then we can put all of our JavaScript code right here. So here's a little bit of review on event handling. Let's see. Let's take a look at this page in the browser. Actually, I've got it open right, where is it? Right here. And so we've got some buttons and some other stuff that we're going to play with on this page. So here's what we're going to be dealing with in the browser. Okay, let's go ahead and get handles on these 3 buttons right away and start working with them. So right here, I'm just going to put a few blank lines in here to give myself some breathing room. Let's go ahead and declare a constant and call it btn1, and we'll set that equal to document.querySelector. We're going to use querySelector the more modern way. We're not going to use getElementById. All right, so there we go. I got my parentheses in place. So now remember that with querySelector, you have to use a CSS selector, and you pass that in as a string. So I'm going to pass in a string like this, and we want to grab these buttons by their IDs. So I want to start it off with a hashtag, and then the ID for the first button is btn1. Okay, I'm going to put a semicolon right there. Okay, so that's going to give us a handle on that first button on the page, and then we're going to store it in that variable. It's going to be an element object. It's going to have a bunch of properties and methods that we can use to play around with it. Okay, go ahead and do Alt-Shift-Down arrow 2 times to duplicate that line, and then we'll get the other 2 buttons. So let's change that to btn2, and then the next one to btn3. And then don't forget you have to change it on the other side too, because the IDs of those other buttons are btn2 over there, and then btn3 right there. Okay, now we're ready to start hooking up event handlers to these buttons. Just as a review, we'll take the first button and do something very similar to what we did last semester. So we'll take that btn1 element object or DOM object, whatever you want to call it. We'll call the add event listener method. That will take the first parameter is going to be the event that we're listening for. So we'll use click. So right now what we're doing is we're waiting for click events to occur on this button. The second parameter is going to be our event handler. So put a comma there and then put in the arrow function. So that's pair of parentheses, fat arrow, curly braces, and then split those curlies apart like that. Okay, and then, I don't know, just put a simple console log in there. Okay, I'm not even going to bother to run this code. I think it's going to work, but maybe you should run it just to make sure you don't have any errors. Maybe I should too, because I've been known to have errors, but I'm just going to move on here to try and keep the video moving. All right, so For the other two buttons, we're going to have them use the same event handler. Now, I think we covered this very briefly at the end of the last class, but let's dig into it a little bit more now. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a named function, and once it has a name, that means that you can reuse it in different places. You just have to refer to it by its name. What we have up here is an anonymous function. So that's our event handler right there. It has no name. It's an anonymous function, which means that this is the only place that function can be used. Because if I wanted to use the same exact function somewhere else in my code, I would have no way to refer to it because it has no name. All right, so here's what we're going to do right here. We're going to go ahead and declare a named function. So we'll go const and we'll call it some event handler. There you go. There's a generic name. Okay, and we're going to set that equal to an arrow function. So parentheses, fat arrow, curly braces. Okay, and then I suppose I'll just put a stupid console log inside the body of that function. It doesn't really matter what it says. Okay. And now we can go ahead and hook up this named function as the event handler for clicks on BTN2 and BTN3. So to do that, I can take BTN2 and call add event listener. And the first parameter is going to be a string that says click. And the second parameter is going to be the name of our function, some event handler. Okay, now it's very important here that you don't put parentheses here, because we're not invoking this function right now. All we're doing is passing it in as a parameter by name, and the function will actually be invoked by the browser later when the browser detects the click event on BTN2. Okay, so this is an important point that we're going to talk about more. We define event handlers, but we never invoke them ourselves. We give them to the browser to invoke them. And here's how we do that. We call add event listener. So the browser keeps track of all the events that occur inside the browser window. And whenever an event occurs, it checks to see if there's a listener that's hooked up to it. And if it finds one, it invokes it then. So the important thing here to note is that we don't invoke our event handlers. We define them, but we don't invoke them. So it's the browser that invokes them. So right here, you just give it the name of the event handler and you don't put the pair of parentheses after it because we don't want to invoke it. The browser does. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a second. I'm going to put a semicolon there and then do Alt-Shift-Down arrow to duplicate this and then change the BTN2 right there to BTN3. Okay, so now what we've got is because we were using a named function, we can reuse it. So I can refer to it by its name here, and I can reuse it and refer to it by its name here. Okay, now there are scenarios where you want to do that. Many times you can get by with an anonymous function because you basically just want to use that function in one place and one place only, but there are times when it's advantageous to create a named function and you can reuse it then. Okay, let's see what our code looks like when we run it now. So save your changes and then go back over to the browser and reload the page. Click on BTN. I suppose I'll click on BTN1 just to make sure that works. Okay, I think it worked. It did what I expected it to do. If I click on BTN2, you can see it says hello. If I click on BTN3, it also says hello because it's using the same exact function as BTN2. Okay, so I don't know that any of that stuff was new because I think we covered all that in the last semester. So a lot of that was review. Now I'm going to drop something new on you right now. This is something that I haven't talked about yet, and it's a really big deal. All right, so as I was saying, it's the browser that invokes these event handlers for us. And when the browser does that, it always passes in a parameter to your event handler, always. Okay, so what that means for us is if we're interested in that parameter, all we have to do is declare it right there inside the parentheses of our event handler. Okay, now you can call this parameter anything you want, but I always call it EVT. So let's call it EVT. You could call it X or foo or blah or whatever you want. You get to name your parameters, but I call it EVT because what it is it's an object that represents the event that just occurred. Okay, that sounds kind of weird, but we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper. Okay, now since we've got this parameter here, let's put it in our console log. So go ahead and delete that hello string right there, and let's just console log EVT, that parameter, so we can have a look at it. Okay, save your changes, Alt tab back to the browser, refresh the page, click on BTN2, and here it is. Now it's an object. Hopefully you can recognize that it's an object with properties. If you click that arrow there to crack it open, you can see it's actually got quite a few properties. All right, so as I mentioned, whenever the browser invokes one of your event handlers, it will always pass in an object, and that object gives you details about the event. Okay, that might kind of sound weird. Like, what do you mean the details about the event? Okay, well, for example, here's a client X and client Y property that's inside this event object. I believe what this tells you is where on the button that you clicked. So I'll get, if I click over here on this part of the button, that'll have an effect on client X and client Y. If I click over here, it'll be different. Okay, so you can figure out where on the button the click occurred. Okay, and then there's some other properties that we'll be playing with later. Page X and page Y, we'll see those later. Okay, and I don't know what a lot of these properties mean, but there's a couple more. Like right here, look at this. There's a type property. So that tells us that the event was a click event. You see that? Okay, but there is one very important property that we all need to understand, and it's the target. So here's what I want to do. Let's go back over to our code, and let's just log the target property here. So let's do evt.target. Okay, what is the target of an event? Very important for you to know. So if I go back over to the browser and reload the page, click on BTN2, and look at what I see here. It's actually BTN2. If I hover over that, you can see up above that the browser is highlighting it. Okay, click on BTN3. Okay, so in this case, the target of the event was BTN3. Okay, all right, so the target of the event is the thing that received the event. In other words, if you click on something and you're listening for click events, the thing that you click on is the target. Okay, now this can come in handy because it allows you to make your event handlers dynamic. I'll show you what I mean here. So I may know that I want to reuse this event handler in a bunch of different places, but I might want to change the way it works depending on what the target is. So we could do something like this. Now, this target right here, it's the same thing. Well, if I click on BTN2, then this target is the same as that variable right there. They're the same exact thing. This target is pointing to that object right there. So you know a little bit about these DOM objects. They have properties that you can access that represent the attributes of the, in this case, the button element. Okay, let me show you how that works here. So I'm gonna comment out this console log, and let's put an if statement here right underneath it. So set up an if statement. So do if pair parentheses, pair curly braces, split the curly braces apart. And what we can do is inside the parentheses for our Boolean expression, we can go if evt.target.id is double equal to btn1, the string btn1, then we know that it was btn1 that got clicked on. Okay, so here inside the body of that if statement, we'll just do a console log. I'm losing my voice. I've had to reshoot this video like 4 times now because I keep messing it up. Okay, anyways, for our console log, I'll just make it say BTN2. I do have a typo here. I want that to be BTN2, not BTN1. Okay, let's turn this into an else if statement. So right there, after that closing curly brace, we'll do else space if, pair parentheses, pair curly braces, split the curlies, and then put your cursor in between the parentheses. And here we can do if evt.target.id is double equal to the string btn3, then we could do something else, because we know at that point it was btn3 that was the target of the event. So I'll just, since we don't have a good use case here, I'll just do a stupid console log that says btn3. All right, so the target of an event is the thing that received the event. In this case, we are listening for click events. It's the thing that got clicked on, either btn2 or btn3 or whatever else we might hook this event handler up to. Save that, go back over to the browser, reload the page. It should say btn2 if you click on btn2, and then btn3 if you click on btn3. Okay, let's play around with some different types of events right here. Let's we did an example similar to this last year, but we're going to take it a little bit further this time around. Right here under our last bit of code right here. Now make sure you're inside the event handler for the window load event. So right here, if your code's indented properly, there's where our window load handler starts. And if I drop down and follow that plumb line straight down, there's where it ends. I want to stay inside of that event handler, the one that handles the window load event. Okay, we've got a couple of text boxes here. Now I think we did this example in the last class, but we're going to do it again, and I've got a fun activity that we might do in class to take it a step further. But what I want to show you now is that there are different types of events, many different types of events. So we've been talking about the basic ones, click events. That's probably the most common one, but there might be hundreds of events. I'm not really sure, but there are many. And you guys are going to be doing research, and you get to pick one to research. So that'll be really interesting to see what you guys come up with, because there's so many interesting events that you could explore. Let's talk about mouse move events, and then we've got these two text boxes right here that can help us with that. So let's go ahead and get handles on those text boxes. So we can do this const txt page capital X like that, and you'll see why I called it txt page X in a moment. Make sure that X at the end is capital. We're going to set that equal to document.query selector. And then here I want to do, in my notes I'm using get element by ID, which is not what I want to be doing. We want to go with the modern approach. So we'll go hashtag txt page X. Okay, make sure you get the capitalization correct. And then go ahead and duplicate that line down, and then change the X to Y. So again, it's a capital, so I'm going to change that to a capital Y, and then over here, I'm going to change that to a capital Y also. Okay, so now we should have a handle on those two text boxes. And then what we'll do is we'll listen for mouse move events on the window. So anytime the mouse moves within the window, we can trigger our event handler. Or in other words, the browser will invoke our event handler, even if we move the mouse just 1 pixel. Okay, so we'll take the window object and call add event listener, and we're going to be listening for mouse move events. So type in mouse move all lowercase and spell it right. Okay, and then we'll pass in an arrow function for the second parameter, pair parentheses, fat arrow curly braces, and then split the curlies apart like that. And now we do want to make use of that event object. Okay, so in this, if you don't care about it, you can just leave those parentheses empty. But if you want to make use of it, then you have to give it a name. I always give it the name EVT. Okay, and then inside the body of this event handler, we are going to take our txt page X that's going to be a text box, and you guys know by now, hopefully, that text box objects have a .value property, and we're going to set it equal to, and now we're going to take some information out of the event object. We're going to set it equal to evt.pageX. So that's a capital X right there. Okay, and then you can duplicate that line, Alt-Shift down arrow, and change the capital X to a capital Y on both sides of the equal sign. Okay, save your changes, Alt-Tab back to the browser, reload the page, and look at the text boxes. So they're tracking the coordinates of the mouse here. So I think I told you last semester that in computer graphics, the origin is in the top left corner. So here, if I move my mouse all the way up to the top left corner, as far as I can, my numbers are going to get closer and closer to 0. Okay, now the window is scrolled down a little bit. Make sure you scroll up to the very top of the window and then try it. So get your mouse as close to the upper left corner of the window as you can. Oops, I got to rearrange some things here. And you should get close to 0, 0. There we go, pretty close. I'm 1 pixel off. Okay, I do have a fun activity for us to continue with an example like this that we'll hopefully do in class. Remind me if you want to do it. So there's a little taste of mouse events, and there are other mouse events other than just mouse move events. Okay, next we're going to talk about keyboard events. So that's when a keyboard gets pressed, or we'll see other variations of that too. So go back over to VS Code, and then scroll down, make sure you're still inside the window load handler. And then let's try this. Let's get a handle on this text box right here, this one, and its ID is txt1. So we can go const txt1 equals document dot query selector, and then don't forget that hashtag. We're using an ID selector to grab something that has the ID of txt1. All right, now that we've got a handle on that text box, we can hook up event handlers to it. So on the next line, do txt1.add event listener. We're going to listen for key press events. So the first parameter is going to be a string that says key press, just like that, all lowercase. The next parameter is going to be our anonymous arrow function. So parentheses, fat arrow, curly braces, and then split the curlies apart like that. Now we do actually want to make use of the event object here. So I'm going to put EVT in as the name for that object, or that parameter that gets passed in when the browser invokes our event handler for us. And then here, let's just go ahead and console log the event just to take a look at it. So console log EVT. Okay, save your changes. Alt tab back to the browser. Reload the page. And put your cursor inside of that text box and then press a key. Okay, and there we go. So now, in order for this to work, the thing that you're listening for events on has to have focus. So if I click over here, out, in the window somewhere, and I press a key, I'm pressing a key, nothing's going to happen. We're listening for key press events on this text box. So that means that in order for our event handler to get triggered, it has to be a key press event that that when this text box has focus, as we say. Focus means that the cursor's in it. You can see the cursor flashing in it. That means that this thing has focus, this text box. Okay, but if you put your cursor in there and give it focus, and then start pressing buttons, you can see the event object that the browser passed in as a parameter. So let's take a look at this thing right here. You can see it's an object. Now here it's a different type of event than what we saw with our click event. Okay, so different events have different properties. They're different objects. So let's take a look at some of the stuff inside of here. I don't know what most of these mean, but the key one is tells you which key got pressed on. So this time I must have pressed on the F key. Okay, here let's just go ahead and console log the key property. So evt.key. Save that. Go back over to the browser, reload, clear the log, and then give focus to that text box. And then there you go. I clicked on S and then F and so on and so forth. And then I clicked on space. And then if I hit enter, that's what shows up. Okay. So if you want to get down to the nitty gritty, you can explore the different properties to learn more about the things that you can do with these events. But here's, and the other thing I want to point out is here we're listening for key press events. There's other keyboard events too, like a key down. That's when you just put your thumb, press down on a key. A key up is when you release a key. I think a key press is both of those. I think they have to happen like in sequence, so I'm not really sure. But there's other keyboard events, and if you want to explore some of them, you could do that for your research topic. Okay, so there's keyboard events. Another type of event which is really important to us is form events. So if I go back over to the browser here, rearrange a few things. Here I put a form on the page. So as web developers, one of our most important jobs is to create pages that have forms, and then we have to process the data that users enter into these forms. So let me show you a form event right here. If we go back over to VS Code, we need to get a handle on the form. Here, let's just do a quick review of forms. So I'm going to scroll down the page until I find that form. Here it is. Here's the form element, and you can see that it's got an ID right there. It also has a method attribute, which we haven't talked about yet, and we probably won't much until later in this semester or maybe even next semester. But you should know about that. The action attribute, that is going to be, the value of that is going to be the page that receives the data when the form gets submitted. I can show you that in just a second. We've got a few text boxes and labels. There's a text box right there. And that name attribute is very important. We'll see that in just a second too. And then here's another text box that has a name of age. And then finally here we have our submit button. So there's the input element can kind of take on various forms depending on how you set its type attribute. Okay. Going back over the page right here, if I go ahead and hit the submit button, it takes you to a page on my website that basically just regurgitates whatever the form said to it. So right here, you can see here's the name attribute, or from the text box, from the text boxes, here's the name attribute. It's very important to set name attributes on all your input elements in a form because they act as the label. So I didn't actually enter anything into the form right here. Let me go ahead and do that. So I'll type in my name and then my age, and then I'll hit submit here. And there you go. And now we get the label through that name attribute and then the value that was entered right there. Okay. Okay. But here's what I want to show you. Super important for web developers. I'm going to hit the back button here. Let's just say that, what if I forget to enter my name, but the name is required? If I hit submit, I send basically invalid data to my form handler page. So what we can do is we can hook up an event handler to intervene when the data is not valid. I'll show you what I mean here. I'm going to hit the back button and let's go back to VS Code. So scroll back up to your JavaScript code here. Go right after the last example that we just wrote. And we're going to get a handle on the form. So you can go const form equals document.query selector. And then the ID of the form is survey form, I believe. So got to put a hashtag first because we're using query selector. And then survey form like that. I think that should do it for us. And then let's hook up an event handler to it. So we've got the form element, or the form element object, I should say, right here in that variable. So we're going to take that element object and call add event listener on it. And here we're going to listen for submit events for when the form gets submitted. So the first parameter there is going to be submit. The second parameter is going to be our anonymous arrow function. Okay, and then split the curly braces apart. Okay, and now we do want to make use of that object that the browser is going to give us every time it calls an event handler for us. So I'm going to put EVT inside of the as a parameter for my event handler. And I want to show you what we can do here. So at this point, the form gets submitted. We can determine that if it's not valid, then we can prevent the form from being submitted. Look, if I take that EVT object, you know that objects have methods as well as properties. So I'm going to call a method called prevent default, just like that. Okay, so EVT.prevent default, and that's camel case. Look at what happens when I do that. If I save my changes, go back over to the browser, reload. Now, when I hit submit, it's not submitting. That's because we're preventing the default behavior of the event. Okay, now you can prevent the default behavior of different events, but it's not all that common to do it other than for form events. But what this allows us to do is we can determine whether the form is valid or not. And if it's not valid, then we prevent it from submitting. And we don't allow it to submit until the data is valid. I'll show you what I mean here. Let's go ahead and comment this out. And let's put some validation code in place here. Now this is super important stuff because as web developers, you write a lot of validation code to make sure that people enter proper data into your forms. Okay, let's get handles on the input boxes that are inside this form. So we can go const txt first name equals document. Whoops, I want to show you something here. Instead of calling query selector on the document, I'm going to actually call it on the form. So do form.querySelector. I'll explain why in just a second here. And then what we're looking for here, here's a selector that we talked about on day one of this class. We're going to use square brackets. That means that we're selecting something by an attribute. In this case, we want to select something by its name attribute. So I'm going to go name equals first name camel case, like that. Okay, so hopefully you recognize that selector from day one of this class. All right, why did I use form here instead of document.querySelector? Well, the reason why is because I can, if I know that what I'm looking for is inside the form, I can optimize my code a little bit. If I use document here, that would search the entire document for whatever I specify in the parameter here. But if I know what I'm looking for is inside that element, then I can restrict the search to just inside that element. So that's a little bit of an optimization right there. Put a semicolon on that line and then duplicate the line. And then the other text box is for age. So change that to txt age. And then make sure you change the attribute here. The name attribute is set equal to age, like that. And that should give us a handle on both text boxes now. Okay, and now here's what we can do. Is we can put an if statement right here, still inside of our submit event handler. We can go if pair parentheses, pair curly braces, split the curlies apart, and then we can check the value of txt first name. So we can go txt first name dot value. If that's double equal to an empty string, then it's not valid. So in this case, what we could do is alert something like name is required. And then we're going to prevent the default behavior of this event, just like we did before, evt.prevent default. Okay, all right, go ahead and save that. And then let's check it out here. Reload the page, submit the form. It's saying name is required. Okay, submit name is required. Okay, this time I'm going to put a value inside of there and enter my name and then hit submit. And now it goes through. Okay, so there we can use that event object to intervene for submit events and prevent the default behavior unless the form is valid. Okay, let's see, I suppose let's go ahead and validate the age too. Now with the age, there's not only should it not be empty, it should be a number greater than 0. So there's two things we want to check for age. For the name, we just checked to make sure it wasn't empty. Okay, anyways, put your cursor right there after that first if statement, and let's write another if statement. So we'll go if, pair of parentheses, pair of curly braces, split the curlies, move into the parentheses, and we can do this. Let's go txt age dot value. If that's equal to an empty string, then we can alert age is required and then prevent the default behavior. So the next line down right under the alert is going to be evt.prevent default. Now we wouldn't really want to use alerts. We want to avoid those because they're real amateurish. There's better ways to display the error messages. Okay, but we'll explore those later. Okay, so if the age is empty, then we'll see that alert and we prevent the default behavior of the event. We'll add an else if here and make this an if else if statement. So here we'll go else space, else space if, pair of parentheses, pair of curly braces, split them curlies. And here what we'll do is for our Boolean expression, we'll go if txt age, what did I do? Txt age dot value. We'll say if it's, let's do this. How do we want to do this? Let's make sure. Let's do it like this. Now I want to make sure. I want to if it's not greater than 0. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm actually going to use the not operator over here. And then be careful, you want to put parentheses there and there. Now that's a tricky one. We can talk about this in class if you want. But what this is saying is that if the value of txt age is not greater than 0, then it's not valid. So here we can show an alert, and we can make it say alert age must be a number greater than 0. Okay, and then we prevent the default behavior. So we can go evt.prevent default like that. Okay, let's give that a whirl right here. So this is a nasty one. You got to be, if you don't put the parentheses there, then this won't work right. So make sure you get that just right, otherwise it won't work. And now we can talk about this in class if you want to, just ask me about it. But that's a nasty one that has caused me problems in the past. Save your changes. Go back over to the browser. I have to hit the back button here to go back to our form, and then I have to refresh it to get the changes here. And I'm just going to enter my name so I don't worry about that one. And then if I leave the age empty, it should say age is required. Okay, so I'm going to enter something, but it's not going to be a number greater than 0. So I hit submit, and it says age must be a number greater than 0. Okay, this time I'll go ahead and enter my age and hit submit, and then everything goes through now. Okay, so that validation code that we just wrote, that's a really important thing that web developers have to deal with, is writing validation code to make sure that you get valid input. Okay, let's hit the back button. Now, next we're going to talk about change events. So I've got a select here that allows you to select a color. And then I've got a checkbox that you can agree to our terms by checking the box. So whenever I change the selected option, that triggers a change event. Whenever I check or uncheck the box, that triggers a change event. So let's see how this works here. And then after we explore those, I'll show you how change events work on text boxes. So anyways, go back over to VS Code right here. Make sure you're still inside the window load handler. So there's where it starts. there's where it ends. I want to still be inside there, so I put my cursor right there. And let's get a handle on the select box. So we can go const SEL equals document dot query selector, and I think, let me check and see what that thing, how we can get a handle on that thing. There it is. I can get a handle on it by its name, like so. So we scroll back up, and here I put in quotation marks, then square brackets, and then we want to get the thing that has its name equal to color. Okay, that should give me the select box. At that point, I should be able to hook up an event handler on it. So I'll go sel.add event listener, and we're going to listen for change events. So add change for that's the first parameter that you pass into add event listener, and then your arrow function or your event handler, whatever you want to call it. Okay, split the curly braces apart. Let's go ahead and let's do this inside the body of the event handler. Let's go console log sel.value. Okay, let's try that. Okay, save your changes, alt tab back to the browser, reload the page, clear the log if you need to. There shows I just selected blue, so the value is blue. So that's a change event, is when you change a select box. Let's do it with the checkbox. Here now, I had a variable. In this case we used SEL to get the value, but I want to show you if I were to add EVT right here, I could also use that to get the value, because I could do it like this: console.log and then evt.target.value. Because now remember, the target is basically the same thing as SEL. Okay, so either one of these approaches would give me the value that was selected inside that select box. All right, let's hook up one to the checkbox. So we can go const chk, I'll just use that for my variable name, and we'll set that equal to document.query selector, and then that thing has a let's see, how do I get a handle on that thing? I'm gonna scroll down to look at it. Okay, it has a name of agree. So if I scroll back up here, I can put in square brackets and then name equals agree. Okay, that'll get a handle on it. And then here I can add an event listener to it now. So I go chk add event listener. We're listening for change events. And then we can put in an arrow function like that. And in this case, I just wanted to show you, something here. Here we could go, we could check to see, here, just do this, console log chk. Now checkboxes, or in other words, these element objects that represent checkboxes, will have a property called checked, and that tells you if the box is checked or not. So we're going to console log the check property of our chk element object. Just like that, checked. Okay, save that. Alt tab over to the browser, reload, and then if I click on that, it says true because it just got checked. If I click on it again, it says false because it's no longer checked. So anyways, that's good to know that checkboxes have a check property, and that's how you can figure out if they're checked or not. And here we just happen to be using a change event to tell us. Do the console log if we want. Now, just like with the example above, I could also access that check property by adding the event parameter here. And then here I could change this to evt.target.checked, because the target is basically the same thing as that variable right there. The target is pointing to the same thing that the CHK variable is pointing to. All right, we can talk about pointers in class too. That's another big topic of programming. Okay, I'm getting tired. We got one more example though. I want to show you what happens when we hook up a change event to a text box. So let's just go back to our text box. Let's just, for the heck of it, let's use this one, txt1. So we've already got a variable. So right here, we can just take txt1. We grab that, we got a handle on that variable earlier. And here we can do .add event listener. And we're going to listen for change events. And then here we'll add our event handler, or our arrow function. So pair of parentheses, fat arrow, curly braces, and then split them curlies. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and add the EVT parameter just for the heck of it, like that. And then here we'll go ahead and just we'll console log evt.target.value. Okay, let's see how this works here. Save that. Go back over to the browser. Reload. Here's the text box we're talking about, the one under keyboard events. I'm going to clear the log here. So now, oh, you know what? That's our key press events from before. Maybe we should disable that. Yeah, you know what? That's going to be confusing, but those are our key press events. So here, let's go back and just comment out that example real quick here. I didn't think about this. So comment those out, but don't comment out this line above here, because we need that variable txt1. Just comment out the add event listener. So select those 3 lines where we're listening for key press events on txt1. So I'm going to select those 3 lines and do Control /, and then that'll get that out of play so we can see what we're interested in here, which is change events. Okay, reload the page, and then now if I just key press in there, nothing happens, but the change event occurs when this thing loses focus. So if I hit tab, that takes the focus down to the next text box, and that's when the change event got triggered. So there I see the value that was entered when the change event occurred. Okay, so that's a change event for a text box occurs when the text box loses focus, meaning that the cursor leaves the text box and goes somewhere else. Okay. But now this is interesting. If I put my cursor back in there and hit tab, it doesn't trigger an event again because the value hasn't changed. But if I put my cursor back in here and change the value by adding a few more, now hit tab, then it triggers the change event. So just by losing focus doesn't necessarily trigger the event. It has to lose focus and the value has to have changed. Okay, now there's a similar event I want to show you here. It's called input. So let's just go back down to the last bit of code that we wrote here. Let's change this to input, and you'll see how this behaves a little bit differently here. Save that, and then go back over to the browser and reload the page. Put your cursor inside of that text box, and now you can see that the input event occurs anytime we do an input in there. It's very similar to the key press event, but they are different events. So they will behave differently, and you'll get objects with different properties when the browser passes in that EVT parameter, or that parameter that it passes in. Okay, here was a flyby of events. There's so much more to events. We could spend a whole semester digging into JavaScript events, at least a 7-week semester maybe. But anyways, that's going to do it for this activity, and hopefully this sets you up to do the events worksheet now. All right, I got to go to bed. Have a good night.